Atheist lecturer challenges God, but this Muslim student gives a profound answer. That day, the atmosphere at one of the most prestigious universities abroad was unusually calm. Inside a spacious lecture hall, students from diverse backgrounds sat in neat rows, their books and laptops open in front of them. At the front of the class stood Professor Eleanor Hart, a 56-year-old lecturer with a dignified presence. Her hair had begun to turn gray, and she wore a neatly pressed black suit, exuding an air of authority. Professor Eleanor was widely known as a highly intelligent and critical academic, outspoken in her atheist views. To her, religion was nothing more than a social construct that restricted rational thought. She often encouraged her students to think logically and critically, challenging their beliefs. Among the students sat an 18-year-old young woman named Asia Malik. Her face was soft, yet her sharp eyes radiated a quiet confidence. Unlike most of her classmates, she wore an elegant dark blue hijab. Asia was no ordinary student. She was a hafiza, someone who had memorized the entire Quran, and she came from a well-educated Muslim family. That morning, the philosophy and science class began as usual. Professor Eleanor picked up a marker and wrote a bold question on the board. Does God really exist? Immediately, whispers spread throughout the classroom. Some students looked intrigued, while others appeared uneasy. Professor Eleanor gave a thin smile as she observed their reactions. Today, we will discuss a fundamental question that has been debated for centuries, she said in a calm yet piercing tone. Is God real, or is he merely a product of human imagination? She paused for a moment before continuing. Many of you may believe in God, but do you truly have a logical reason for it? Or do you simply believe because of your upbringing and traditions? Some students nodded in agreement, while others looked uncertain. Professor Eleanor took a few steps toward the center of the classroom. I want someone to be brave enough to stand up and explain to me, using scientific reasoning, why they believe in God. A heavy silence fell over the room. Not a single student dared to speak. They all knew how sharp and relentless the professor's arguments could be. But, in the middle row, Asia calmly raised her hand. Professor Eleanor looked slightly surprised. Then, with a sarcastic smile, she said, "Ah, we have someone willing to step forward. Please introduce yourself." Asia stood up, her gaze steady and unwavering. "My name is Asia Malik," she said, her voice soft yet firm, "and I believe in God, not just because of faith, but because of science and logic." The classroom fell completely silent. All eyes turned toward Asia. Professor Eleanor crossed her arms over her chest, studying the young woman before her. "All right, Asia," she said, "give me one scientific reason that proves God exists." Her eyes gleamed with challenge. Asia took a deep breath, allowing herself a small smile as she prepared to answer. She understood that this was no ordinary discussion. This was a moment where her belief would be tested in front of an audience shaped by rationality and skepticism. The students held their breath, waiting for her response. Some remained motionless, while others secretly hoped Asia would offer a truly compelling argument. Professor Eleanor raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Well, Asia," she said, her tone laced with doubt, "give me just one scientific reason that proves God exists. And remember, I expect something logical. Or did you already anticipate this question?" Maintaining her composure, Asia began to speak. "Professor, before I answer your question, may I ask you something?" she said. Professor Eleanor narrowed her eyes, considering the request before nodding. "Do you believe that something complex and orderly requires a designer?" Asia Tasso asked. The professor paused for a moment before responding. "Of course. The laws of physics and science show that anything complex typically has a scientifically explainable origin." Asia nodded. "Good. So, if we come across a watch with an intricate and perfectly synchronized mechanism, we must conclude that there is a maker, right?" "Yes, of course," Professor Eleanor answered. Asia nodded briefly, then continued, her voice growing steadier. If that's the case, what about the universe? It is far more complex and orderly than a simple watch. Is it really possible that something so extraordinary just appeared on its own, without anyone creating it? Once again, the class fell into silence. Some students exchanged glances, while others, who had initially shown little interest in the discussion, began to pay close attention. Professor Eleanor chuckled. Asia, I'll admit, your argument is interesting, but it's too simplistic. Science has already proven that the universe came into existence because of the Big Bang, not because of a creator, Professor Eleanor stated. Asia smiled. All right, Professor, I'll follow your line of reasoning. Since we are discussing the Big Bang, I have a question. What triggered the Big Bang? Professor Eleanor sighed before responding. According to science, the Big Bang originated from an extremely small and dense singularity, which then exploded and expanded, forming the universe as we know it today. Asia nodded slowly. So, Professor, do you believe that something can come from nothing? Professor Eleanor hesitated for a brief moment. She knew this was not an easy question to answer scientifically. The law of conservation of energy states that energy cannot be created or destroyed. It can only change form. So, where did the initial energy that triggered the Big Bang come from? Asia Tarsha asked. A quiet murmur spread through the class as students whispered among themselves, discussing Asia's question. Suddenly, a male student sitting in the back raised his hand. Professor, isn't Asia's question reasonable? If everything needs a cause, then shouldn't there be something that caused the universe to exist in the first place? Professor Eleanor's expression turned blank for a moment as she tried to regain control of the discussion. That question is often raised in philosophy, she replied, but science does not need the hypothesis of God to explain the universe. Asia offered a gentle smile. Professor, I understand that science attempts to explain everything without invoking God, but doesn't that also mean science has its limitations? If we are unable to explain something, does that mean it simply doesn't exist? The professor fell silent. She was not someone who could be easily defeated in a debate, but she could feel that Asia was no ordinary student. The girl spoke with unshakable confidence. Still, Professor Eleanor was not ready to concede. She crossed her arms and said, All right, Asia, let's assume for the sake of argument that the universe does have a designer. But how can you be sure that this designer is the God you believe in? Why couldn't it just be the laws of nature working by themselves? Asia took a deep breath before answering. Professor, the laws of nature are part of the order I just spoke about. The law of gravity, the laws of thermodynamics, even the DNA in our bodies. All of them follow structured and precise patterns. The laws of nature cannot create themselves. There must be something that established these laws in the first place, and in Islam, we call that being Allah, the Creator, who was never created. From the corner of the classroom, a female student raised her hand. Asia, I want to know one thing, the student said hesitantly. If God really exists, then why is there so much suffering in this world? Why are there wars, natural disasters, and diseases? Asia turned to the student with a gentle smile. That is a very good question, she said. Many people ask the same thing, but let me ask you something in return. Can we truly understand happiness without ever experiencing sadness? The student fell silent, thinking about the question. Asia continued, In Islam, this world is a test. Every hardship, every challenge has wisdom behind it. We may not always be able to see it immediately, but that does not mean there isn't a greater reason behind it. Think of a small child who does not understand why his parents forbid him from playing with fire. The parents know better than the child. Similarly, we cannot always comprehend the wisdom behind what happens in our lives, but God does. The classroom grew quiet. Many students who had previously been skeptical now seemed deep in thought. Professor Eleanor took a deep breath. She was still searching for a way to dismantle Asia's argument, but the girl remained calm and composed. However, the professor was not one to give up easily. She looked at Asia with a sharp gaze and said, "I must admit you are very good at debating, but is your belief based only on logic, or is there an emotional reason that makes you so sure?" Asia met the professor's gaze with eyes full of confidence. She knew this was a decisive moment. Taking a deep breath, she answered, "Professor, my belief is not just based on logic. I have witnessed God's miracles in my own life. I feel His presence in every breath I take, in every verse I read, and in every prayer I make." Her voice deepened, filled with emotion. "I believe in God, not because I was simply taught to believe in Him, but because I have found Him through my own experiences. And I believe that anyone who sincerely searches for the truth will find it too." The room fell into complete silence. Even Professor Eleanor did not respond immediately. Some students looked moved, while others were still processing Asia's words. Finally, the professor gave a small smile, but this time, her smile was different. It was no longer condescending, but rather the smile of someone whose mind had been touched by something profound. However, she was not finished yet. She took a step closer to Asia and said, "All right, Asia, I admit that your answers have been very thought-provoking, but I have one last question." The entire class held their breath. Asia met the professor's gaze, prepared for what could possibly be the most difficult question of this debate. The professor's eyes remained sharp, showing that there was still something troubling her. Asia waited as the professor said in a serious tone, "So far, I admit that your arguments have been strong, but there is one thing you haven't answered yet." She paused, letting the anticipation build before finally continuing. "If the God you believe in is truly almighty, then why doesn't He reveal Himself to us? Why is His existence so vague? If He truly exists, why must humans search for Him?" Some students slowly nodded, as if the question had also been lingering in their own minds. It was a question that many skeptics had asked before. Asia did not respond immediately. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, as if collecting her thoughts. Then she opened them and looked directly at the professor. "Professor," she said softly, "do you believe that love exists?" Professor Eleanor frowned, slightly surprised by the question. "Of course," she replied firmly. Asia tilted her head slightly. "Then can you show me love physically? Can you take it out of someone's heart, place it on this table, and say, 'Here, this is love'?" Professor Eleanor fell silent. She began to understand where this conversation was headed. Asia continued, "Love is something real, but we can't see it directly. We only feel it through signs, the way someone treats us, their sacrifices, the warmth we feel when we're with the ones we love." Some students began to nod, realizing the depth of Asia's words. "God is the same way," she continued. "We may not see Him directly, but the signs of His existence are everywhere, in the beauty of nature, the balance of the laws of physics, the ongoing miracle of life. Just as we recognize love through its signs, we recognize God through His creation." Professor Eleanor stared at Asia, her expression difficult to read. She hadn't expected this girl to turn her argument around in such a simple yet powerful way. But she still wouldn't give up. "Asia, I understand your analogy," she said in a calmer tone. "But still, if God truly wanted us to believe in Him, why wouldn't He just reveal Himself? Wouldn't that make things much easier?" Asia smiled slightly. "Professor, if a teacher gives a test to their students, does the teacher provide all the answers before the test begins?" Professor Eleanor fell silent again. Asia continued, "This world is a test, Professor. If God revealed Himself directly, where would the test be? Faith is not about being forced to believe because of undeniable evidence. It's about belief that grows from a heart sincerely seeking the truth." Silence once again filled the room. The students were beginning to understand that this debate was not just an exchange of logical arguments, but something much deeper. Suddenly, a student in the middle row raised his hand. His name was Michael, a physics student known for being skeptical of religion. "Sorry," he said hesitantly, "but I have one question. If God really exists and He is the most just, then why is there so much injustice in this world? Why do good people suffer while bad people live comfortably?" Asia turned to Michael and gave him a gentle smile. She could tell that his question wasn't just about logic, it was personal. "Michael, have you ever seen an artist paint a masterpiece?" she asked. Michael frowned, unsure where this was going. "Yes, of course. When the artist first starts painting, can we immediately understand what he is creating?" Michael shook his head. "Number. Sometimes, at first, it just looks like a mess of colors." Asia nodded. "That's exactly how life is. We only see a small part of the grand painting that God is creating. Right now, we may only see suffering and injustice, but we don't see the full picture. Everything in this world has a purpose, even if we don't understand it at the moment." Michael fell silent. He hadn't expected his question to be answered in such a profound way. Professor Eleanor carefully observed the students, watching their expressions as they seemed to be reevaluating their perspectives. She could feel the debate shifting from an intellectual discussion to something much more personal and emotional. But she still had one last argument to make. "Asia," she said, her voice lowered but sharper, "you speak so confidently about God and His justice, but what about religion itself? Religion has often been a source of conflict, wars, divisions, even terrorism. Many people claim to act in the name of God. How can you defend something that has brought so much destruction?" The class grew tense. This was a difficult question. Asia took a deep breath. She knew this was the most critical moment. "Professor," she said gently, "is a knife good or bad?" Professor Eleanor frowned. "It depends on how the knife is used." "Exactly," Asia said. "A knife can be used to prepare a beautiful meal, but it can also be used to harm someone. Can we blame the knife for how it is used?" Professor Eleanor remained silent. Asia continued. "The same applies to religion. Religion is a tool. If used correctly, it brings peace, compassion, and justice. But if it falls into the wrong hands, it can be misused for evil. The problem is not religion itself, it's how humans choose to use it." Some students began to clap softly, recognizing the depth of Asia's response. The debate had reached its peak, and many felt that her answer was not only logical but also deeply meaningful. Professor Eleanor took a deep breath. She looked at Asia with a different expression than before. There was something in her eyes, no longer just a desire to win, but perhaps respect. Yet she wasn't finished. She exhaled slowly, then said, "Asia, you have given very good answers, but I still have one last question." Asia met the professor's gaze, calm and ready to hear the question that might bring this debate to its peak. Professor Eleanor looked at her deeply and, in a softer voice, asked, "If God really exists, have you ever personally experienced something that proves His existence?" The classroom fell silent again. All eyes were on Asia, waiting for an answer, one that might change everything. Asia took a deep breath. She knew this was the moment to speak from more than just logic. This was the moment to speak from the heart. The students who had previously been taking notes were now holding their breath. Even Professor Eleanor, who had seemed so sure of her argument from the beginning, now looked at the girl with a different expression, not as someone trying to win a debate, but as someone who truly wanted to hear the answer. Asia inhaled deeply. "This is no longer about winning an argument," she said softly. "This is about something real." She paused, then continued. "Professor, you asked me if I have ever personally experienced something that proves God's existence. The answer is yes, not just once, but many times." She looked around at the entire class before continuing. I want to tell you something. An experience that I know is not just a coincidence. The students leaned forward, their curiosity piqued. When I was 10 years old, Asia began, I was in an accident. My mother and I were walking home from school when a truck lost control and came straight toward us. I remember those seconds so clearly, my mother trying to shield me, people screaming, and in my heart, I only had time for one small prayer. Oh, God, please save us. Some students seemed visibly moved, their expressions shifting as they listened. Asia continued. The truck should have hit us. There was no time to run, no way to escape, but at the last second, something happened. The truck's tires suddenly slipped, and instead of crashing into us, it swerved and slammed into an electric pole nearby. My mother and I were completely unharmed. Even the driver was safe. She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. Many people called it luck, but I know it wasn't just coincidence. It was an answer to the prayer I whispered in total surrender. Professor Eleanor watched Asia, her eyes unreadable, as if she was processing something beyond just words. But Asia wasn't done. And not only that, she continued, there are many things that we can't explain logically. She looked around the classroom. Have you ever felt so desperate, so alone, and then, just at the right time, someone came to help? Have you ever seen someone who had almost lost hope, and suddenly a solution appeared, one they never expected? Have you ever felt an extraordinary calm while praying, even though your problem hadn't been solved yet? The class remained silent. Many students began to reflect, recalling their own personal experiences. Asia spoke again, her voice softer this time. Professor, God is not always present in a form that we can see with our eyes, but He is always present in a form that we can feel, through the help that arrives just when we need it, through the peace that no science can explain, through the small miracles we often overlook. Professor Eleanor remained silent. Her eyes seemed glassy, as if she was holding back an emotion she wasn't ready to show. Then, in a voice quieter than before, she said, Asia, your answer is very compelling. I must admit, I have never heard someone explain faith in this way before. Asia smiled gently. Professor, I am not asking you to believe immediately. Faith is not something that can be forced. But I invite you to think, to see life from a different perspective. Because sometimes the truth is not just what we understand with our minds, but what we feel with our hearts. The atmosphere in the classroom grew solemn. Some students bowed their heads, moved by the conversation they had just witnessed. Professor Eleanor finally took a deep breath. When she looked at Asia again, her expression had changed, no longer full of challenge, but full of respect. You are an extraordinary young woman, Asia, she said at last. I may still have many questions, but I must admit, your way of thinking has opened a new perspective for me. Asia smiled. Thank you, Professor. Professor Eleanor turned to her students, glancing at them one by one. Then, in a low but firm voice, she said, I want all of you to take something from today's debate. No matter what your beliefs are, the most important thing is to think critically and seek the truth with an open heart. The students nodded in agreement. This was more than just a debate. It was an intellectual journey, one that had opened the minds of many in the room. As the class ended, several students gathered around Asia, eager to continue the discussion. Even Michael, the skeptical student who had asked sharp questions, remained in his seat, lost in thought, contemplating everything he had heard. Meanwhile, Professor Eleanor walked out of the classroom, her steps slow and deliberate. On her face was an expression difficult to decipher, perhaps confusion, perhaps contemplation, or maybe something even deeper. Maybe, for the first time in her life, she was beginning to ask herself, had she spent all these years closing the door to something greater than she could understand? And maybe, just maybe, somewhere deep within her heart, She had already begun searching for the answer. Moral message. Faith is not something that can be forced. It must be found with an open heart. Miracles do not always appear in the way we expect, but they are always present for those who are willing to see them. Seeking truth requires not only logic, but also inner sensitivity and personal experience. Differences in belief should not divide us, but instead be opportunities for discussion, learning, and mutual respect. Final reflection. This story is more than just a debate. It is a journey in search of meaning. Sometimes the answers we seek are not found in words, but in experience and deep reflection. If this story inspires you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so we can continue bringing meaningful stories to life. See you in the next story.